The feeling of being turned away at a restaurant, with the harsh words, "We don't serve people like you here." That sting, sharp and jarring, cut through the excitement of what should have been a joyful night. The evening air was crisp in Atlanta, with a faint hum of city life drifting in from the streets. Angela Taylor adjusted her gold hoop earrings, her confidence mirrored in the click of her heels against the pavement. Her friends walked beside her, their laughter punctuating the night as they approached the entrance of Crown and Scepter, a well-known upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. Tonight was a celebration. Angela's best friend Danielle was turning 30, and they were determined to make it a night to remember. The restaurant's glass doors gleamed under the dim glow of its golden signage. Inside, polished hardwood floors reflected the ambient lighting, and smooth jazz danced softly through the air. Servers dressed in crisp white shirts moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of gourmet dishes. The faint aroma of seared steak and truffle oil wafted through the room. Angela pushed open the door, holding it for her friends. They stepped inside, their laughter dimming as they took in the elegant setting. Angela wore a navy blue dress that hugged her frame, her hair styled in soft curls. Beside her, Danielle radiated joy in a bright red jumpsuit, her smile lighting up the room. The rest of the group, 4 in total, were equally vibrant, their outfits reflecting the celebratory mood. The hostess, a young woman with a tight bun and a nervous smile, glanced up from her podium. Her eyes flickered briefly over the group before she plastered on a professional expression. "Welcome to Crown and Scepter. Do you have a reservation?" Angela stepped forward. "Yes, Taylor. Party of 5 at 7:30. She smiled warmly, feeling the excitement bubbling within her. The hostess scanned her tablet, her fingers moving hesitantly. Then she glanced over her shoulder toward the back of the room. Angela followed her gaze and noticed a man standing near the bar. A tall, middle-aged man in a tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his sharp features were marred by a look of disapproval. The hostess leaned closer to the man, whispering something. He looked up, his eyes locking briefly with Angela's before returning to the hostess. He nodded curtly and began walking toward the podium. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I'm Blake, the manager. How can I help you?" Angela tilted her head, a polite smile still lingering. "We have a reservation. Taylor, party of 5. Mr. Blake folded his arms, his gaze icy. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight." Angela blinked, momentarily stunned. "Fully booked?" she repeated, glancing over his shoulder. The dining room was far from packed. At least 5 tables were visibly empty, their pristine white tablecloths untouched. "Yes, we're at capacity," Mr. Blake said, his tone firm. Angela exchanged a look with Danielle, who frowned. "But there are empty tables," Angela said, her voice calm but questioning. Mr. Blake's lips tightened. "Those tables are reserved." "For who?" Angela asked, her brow furrowing. Her tone remained polite, but there was an edge of confusion now. "That's none of your concern," he replied curtly, shifting uncomfortably. Angela's stomach tightened. She could feel her friends behind her, their energy shifting from excitement to unease. "We made this reservation a week ago," she said, her voice steady. "We're here to celebrate a special occasion. Surely you can accommodate us." Mr. Blake's jaw clenched. "As I said, we're fully booked." The room seemed to grow quieter. Nearby diners began to glance over, their conversations faltering as they noticed the tension. A server paused mid-step, his tray wobbling slightly as he took in the scene. Angela took a deep breath, fighting the rising frustration in her chest. "I don't mean to be difficult," she said, her tone measured, "but this doesn't seem fair. We planned this night carefully, and it's clear there's room for us here." Mr. Blake's gaze hardened. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," he said, his words heavy with implication. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. Danielle's mouth fell open, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. One of their friends, Marcus, muttered under his breath, "Wow, seriously?" Angela felt a wave of emotions crash over her. Humiliation, disbelief, anger. She straightened her posture, her voice remaining calm despite the storm brewing inside. "Is there a reason we're being refused service?" Mr. Blake didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked briefly over the group, his disdain thinly veiled. "As I said, we're at capacity," he repeated, his tone dismissive. Nearby, a family seated at a corner table exchanged glances. The father, a middle-aged black man, looked down at his plate, his expression pained. His wife reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Angela's fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But she knew better. This wasn't just about her or her friends. It was about something bigger. She glanced around the room, noting the stares from other diners. Some looked sympathetic. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Taking a steadying breath, Angela looked back at Mr. Blake. "We're not causing a scene," she said firmly. "We're simply asking for the service we were promised." Mr. Blake smirked, a cold, condescending smile. "You people always cause trouble," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Angela to hear. Her heart skipped a beat. The words sliced through her like a blade, sharp and unapologetic. Danielle gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest. Marcus took a step forward, his face taut with anger, but Angela raised a hand, stopping him. She met Mr. Blake's gaze, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "Excuse me?" The room was silent now. Even the jazz music seemed to fade into the background. "I think we're done here," Mr. Blake said, his tone final. "You can see yourselves out." Angela's hands shook as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "If you're refusing us service, I'd like you to say that again. On camera," she said, her voice unwavering. Mr. Blake's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "We're at capacity," he repeated, his tone clipped. Angela stared at him, her phone still recording. She turned to her friends. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight with emotion. As they walked out, Angela felt every eye in the room on her. Murmurs rippled through the diners, a mix of outrage and discomfort. A young couple by the window exchanged glances, the woman whispering, "That was so wrong." Angela pushed the door open, and the cool night air hit Angela like a slap to her senses. She paused, collecting herself. Danielle's hand landed on her shoulder, her voice resolute. "We're not letting this slide. Let's go back inside." Angela nodded, jaw set, fire in her eyes. "You're right," she said, and together they walked back in. The restaurant's golden glow seemed to dim. Its polished exterior was a mask for the ugliness that had unfolded within. Angela stood frozen, phone in hand, still recording as the words Mr. Blake had just spat at her echoed in her mind, replaying like a haunting melody. "You people always cause trouble." A heavy silence filled the space, the air thick with disbelief. Diners stared, mouths agape. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. The venom behind the words, the arrogance that exposed something far deeper than a simple refusal. Her stomach churned, but she held her ground. Her voice, though steady, carried a quiet fury. "Excuse me, did you just say what I think you said?" The room went still, every eye turning toward her. A gasp rippled through the crowd, as the white couple by the window exchanged shocked glances. "Did he really say that? In 2025? The woman whispered. The noise of clinking silverware had stopped, and the soft jazz music faded into the background. Angela's pulse raced, but she kept her eyes locked on Mr. Blake. Angela's fingers gripped the edges of her phone as she held it steady, the camera capturing everything. The weight of the moment felt heavy on her shoulders, but she refused to back down. "Repeat it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried like a command. Mr. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, but he stood his ground. "You heard me," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. "I said you people always cause trouble." The words hung in the air like a toxic fog. It wasn't just the insult. It was the cold, calculated way he'd said them. The way his eyes flickered to the side, almost as if he expected no one to care. But people were beginning to care. A young server, his face pale and his hands trembling, took a tentative step forward, his voice shaking. "Sir, I think you should—" Mr. Blake snapped at him. "Stay out of this." His gaze shifted back to Angela, narrowing with contempt. "This is how we run things here. You can leave if you don't like it." But Angela wasn't leaving, not without making a statement, not without forcing those around her to acknowledge what was happening. Taking a deep breath, Angela lifted the phone higher, ensuring every word, every moment was being captured. This isn't just about tonight, it's about a system that refuses to acknowledge what's right, she said, her voice unwavering, echoing through the room. Discrimination is illegal, it's wrong, and it's happening right here, right now, in front of all of you. Her words were slow but deliberate, each one weighted with the truth. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, some uncomfortable, others empathetic. The murmurs began. "This isn't right," someone from the back of the room whispered. A man, probably in his mid-30s, stood up from his table near the bar. His eyes, wide with disbelief, met Angela's. Without a second thought, he approached the hostess podium. "This is wrong," he said, his voice firm. "I'll give up my reservation so they can sit." Angela's heart skipped. The man's gesture was simple, yet it carried a deep, unspoken message of solidarity. It was the kind of act that made everything feel slightly more bearable. But Mr. Blake wasn't moved. His face flushed with anger, and he took a step forward, hands raised as if to ward off the offer. "No, we don't change our policies for anyone. Not even for you," he snarled. Angela's fist clenched. The man, Jake, she'd heard his name when he introduced himself, looked back at her, his expression one of quiet defiance. He didn't flinch under Mr. Blake's glare. "Thank you," Angela said softly, her voice a mix of gratitude and frustration. "But no one should have to give up their reservation to make room for what's right." She turned back to face Mr. Blake, her eyes burning with determination. "You want to know what's wrong?" she asked, taking a step closer to the podium. "What's wrong is that a person's worth is still being measured by the color of their skin, that a simple dinner out becomes a battleground for dignity." Mr. Blake scoffed, but Angela didn't flinch. "You can refuse us tonight, but you can't erase what you've done. You can't take back those words." She turned to the diners, all still watching, the silence now a heavy presence in the room. "If you stand for this, you're standing against justice," she said, her voice carrying with an authority that shook the very foundation of the room. Angela's words lingered like smoke in the air. The room, filled with tense, uncomfortable silence, began to stir. One by one, diners began to stand. Some left without saying a word. Others exchanged glances and slowly stood, making their way toward the door in quiet protest. Angela watched as the restaurant emptied out, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. People weren't willing to sit idly by and allow injustice to flourish. Not today. And then, as if in slow motion, Angela and her friends began to walk toward the door. Her eyes scanned the room one last time. The once bustling restaurant was now nearly empty, the chairs and tables abandoned. The cold, sterile environment felt hollow. As they reached the door, Angela heard Mr. Blake's voice rise, angry and desperate. "You think this is over? You think anyone cares?" But his words fell on deaf ears. As the door closed behind them, Angela felt a strange sense of relief, tempered by the weight of what was still to come. She was angry, yes, but she was also determined. She wasn't going to let this moment slip by unnoticed. In the distance, sirens blared, a sharp reminder of the world's injustices, but also of the fight that still lay ahead. As Angela stepped into the cool night air, her resolve hardened. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The following morning, Angela's phone buzzed incessantly. She had barely slept, too restless with the weight of what had transpired the night before. But this wasn't a time for rest. It was a time for action. Her hands were steady despite the pounding in her chest. She unlocked her phone, opened her social media accounts, and uploaded the video, raw, uncut, and completely unfiltered. As she pressed post, a feeling of finality washed over her. There was no turning back now, but something deeper gnawed at her. Doubt, fear, the thought that maybe it wouldn't matter. Maybe no one would care. But in a matter of minutes, everything changed. The video exploded. The first comment came in seconds. "This is disgusting. How is this happening in 2025? Then another, "Thank you for standing up for all of us. This isn't just about a restaurant. This is a battle for dignity." And another, "When will people of color take a break?" By the time she checked the video again, it had tens of thousands of views. The comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. Strangers shared their own stories, opening up about their experiences with discrimination, drawing connections to Angela's words. The hashtag began to trend, catching fire across platforms. Angela's heart raced, the recognition both exhilarating and terrifying. The phone rang. It was a news outlet. "Hello, is this Angela Edwards?" A voice crackled on the other end. "Yes, speaking. We'd like to interview you about your experience at Redstone Grill. We've been following your video, and the response has been incredible. Are you available for a live interview in 30 minutes? Her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to breathe. This was bigger than her. This was about something far more important than her own discomfort. "Yes, I'll be ready," she said, more confident than she felt. The call ended, and Angela sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts racing. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every person who had faced the same injustice, who had been made to feel small for something they couldn't control. She stared at the video one more time before the interview. The screen captured her words clearly. This isn't just about one restaurant. It's about systemic issues we face every day. It's about dignity. It's about equality, and it's time for it to stop. The interview was quick but powerful. Angela stood tall, answering questions with passion and clarity. She spoke about racial discrimination in the service industry, how it wasn't just an isolated incident. According to the National Restaurant Association, Black patrons were consistently treated unfairly in restaurants, with studies showing they were 2.5 times more likely to experience poor service than white customers. Angela's voice quivered when she spoke of the personal toll these experiences took on people's lives. "We're talking about dignity here. It's more than just a seat at a table," she said. By the time the interview ended, Angela felt like her heart was on fire. She had done it, but in a way, it felt like just the beginning. Across social media, the public response was swift and overwhelming. Protest groups, civil rights organizations, and even local politicians chimed in. Justice for Angela became the rallying cry. Crown and Scepter posted a public statement. The CEO, in a carefully worded apology, stated that they strongly denounced any form of discrimination. They assured the public that an internal investigation was underway and that Mr. Blake's actions did not reflect the values of the company. The apology was meant to soothe the public outrage, but Angela saw through it immediately. It felt cold, insincere. The next morning, the restaurant's response took a turn. Angela received a call from the Equal Justice Initiative in the NAACP. They were offering their full support, and legal aid was already in motion. Mr. Blake would be held accountable. But this fight was bigger than one man. It was about systemic change. As the public backlash grew, the pressure on the restaurant became unbearable. Boycotts began to ripple through the city, followed by protests outside the restaurant. Angela organized a peaceful march, something small to start, but it quickly gathered steam. People of all races stood side by side chanting for justice. "No justice, no peace," they sang, as they marched in front of Crown and Scepter, with signs that read, "Equality for all" and "Boycott hate." Mr. Blake was fired, but the satisfaction of that action was fleeting. He issued his own statement, insisting that he hadn't been given a fair chance. "I wasn't treated right," he said, his arrogance still present, as if the backlash had somehow been unjustified. But Angela didn't care about him. She cared about what came next. Weeks passed. Crown and Scepter's business plummeted as the protests and boycotts continued. With so much negative press and public outrage, the restaurant made the difficult decision to shut its doors permanently. Angela stood across the street, watching as the last of the restaurant's staff carried out their belongings. There was a sense of closure, but not of triumph. This wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about sending a message. That silence in the face of injustice was no longer an option. A local journalist approached her. "Angela, what's next for you? You've taken on this massive fight, and it's sparked a national conversation." Angela smiled, a quiet strength in her eyes. "I'm just getting started. This fight, it's not just about one restaurant. It's about standing up for what's right. We've got to keep pushing until everyone has a seat at the table." As the news cameras moved on, Angela took a deep breath. Her phone buzzed with messages of support. She scrolled through them, messages from strangers, from people she'd never met. Each one is filled with gratitude, but one stood out among the rest. "You've inspired me to speak out. I'm not staying silent anymore. Thank you for giving me the courage." Angela put the phone down. There would be more work to do and more battles to fight, but today she had made a difference, and that was enough, for now. Have you ever experienced or witnessed injustice? Don't stay silent. Your voice matters. Share your story, support those who need it, and demand change. Every single action, no matter how small, can have a ripple effect. You never know who you might inspire or how far your words can travel. If this video resonated with you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Together we can make sure that the fight for justice doesn't stop here. Sometimes one voice is all it takes to start a movement. Be that voice.